Hi, I'm Chris,
And I'm Terry.
and in today's lecture, we'll be looking at dynamics. You might recall from a previous lecture where I was introducing the three main approaches people have taken to understanding the mind, and the most recent of those was called dynamicism, where they observed that ultimately brains and minds are dynamical systems. They're systems which are essentially defined over time. Time is not arbitrary, it's real time. And that's because these systems are directly connected to their environments. And the analogy people would use is that the mind is something like the weather or some very complex, chaotic, dynamical system, which is ever changing, very difficult to understand in many respects, but essentially temporal. And I think that observation has a lot of value. And that was one of the main motivations behind Principle 3, which is the one we'll be talking about today for the NEF, the principle of dynamics. In the previous lecture, we introduced principles 1 and 2, which were the principles of representation and computation. The representation principle we described as having a nonlinear encoding and a linear decoding. And the computation principle has the same nonlinear encoding, but a different kind of linear decoding, but different in a way that would let you compute nonlinear functions of what you were originally representing. As I also mentioned in a previous lecture, the third dynamics principle really can be thought of as the main principle in some ways of the NEF because it combines the previous two principles. The idea being that the state variables, so these are either control theoretic state variables if you're thinking in terms of control theory, or just state variables for dynamical systems, those are representations, i.e. the things that are represented in the neural activities. And then the functions we need to compute of those representations, which are essential for defining differential equations or dynamical systems, those can be computed by Principle 2. So Principle 3 really brings together Principle 1, which is the neural state representations, and Principle 2, which allows us to compute functions, linear or nonlinear, of those state variables. Now, to dive into this a little bit, I want to explain exactly how we can write differential equations in terms of those two elements. So control theory is one way to think about this. As I've said, dynamical systems theory is another equivalent way. Essentially what we're doing in dynamical systems theory and control theory is describing the change of a state over time. Now, it's been discovered that a very convenient way of doing this is explaining the change of the state in what we call the state space, the set of states that the system can take on over time. So the important part here is that we're just not explicitly drawing time in our picture, as it were. We're only drawing the state. So this could be the position of an object in the world. This could be the amount of voltage and current that are flowing through something. It could be the brightness of a point in an image. Any number of things we can describe as being dynamical systems. But the interesting thing in these state space diagrams is we don't write time down. Instead, we just write the change in state. And time is implicit in the motion that's described by these graphs. So there you saw an example of having a particular starting location, which would be a state, x1 comma x2. And then we need some equation that explains this motion. Our x is our state, x dot, I'm using the dot to indicate the change at an infinitesimal moment in time. And that's exactly what we'd be describing in the state space here in order to explain how the state will change over time. In the most general case, we're going to write this as some arbitrary function f of the current state. And I still find this kind of surprising that writing this very simple equation down lets us describe pretty much anything you can imagine that's changing over time. In the context of the NEF, what we're saying is these states themselves are neural representations. So here we've kind of represented x twice, one as the input and one as the thing which is changing over time. So that would be exactly this state. And what I've drawn here in the red dotted lines, that's a whole bunch of states over time. The transformation, that is the thing that tells us how to map from whatever the current state is onto the next state, that's going to be my f, right? And that's going to be the thing that we compute with principle number 2. And then last but not least, we do have this dot, which is indicating something about time. And that's going to be the thing which is captured by our third principle, the principle of neural dynamics. So to move back to our diagram, if the idea would be that we can write down one equation here, f of x comma t, that describes exactly how x dot changes at this state. It also describes how x dot changes at this state, what x dot is at this state, and so on. So the same equation is governing my motion at every point. And you can imagine, because I haven't put any constraints on how complicated that equation can be, this means that really I could define something which essentially moves in a straight line at this part in the state and then moves completely opposite direction or has some strange curves. You can do whatever you want. And it's the lack of constraints that makes this equation such a powerful one. What about dynamics in neural systems explicitly? Like when we're building simulations in Nengo, as you can see in this slide, we'll end up with a Nengo simulation. In fact, we haven't talked about dynamics explicitly, but it's popped up a couple of times. We've mentioned things like time constants. We've shown you how to build feed-forward networks. And what we're doing really now is being much more explicit about the dynamics in the simulations we've seen. So to think back to some of the simulations you've already run and built yourself, hopefully, we were essentially injecting an input into a population of neurons and then graphing the output. And many times we graphed both the input and the output. The thing we're being more explicit about now is writing down h of t. So this h of t is going to be our postsynaptic current, right? So the model that we've used is this simple exponential decay, and it happens to have a really nice form for doing some analytics, as we'll see later on. But you can technically insert whatever you want in that h of t, and it's acting as our model of what happens when a neural spike arrives at a postsynaptic neuron's dendrite. From a perspective of mathematics, we can think of this as a filter. Because spikes look a lot like delta functions, when we're filtering a set of delta functions, it just means that when we're doing a linear filter, that is, just means that we can put these filters down every time that there is a spike, a delta function, and then add them all up, just as we saw in principle number 1. Of course, the difference now is that we want to be very explicit about what's happening over time. In signals and systems theory, when we're doing that, placing down this function at every time we have a spike, the mathematical expression that captures that behavior is convolution. So if you don't know what convolution is, there's all kinds of nice visualizations and so on the internet. But you can think of it as taking one of those functions, here we'll think of it as h of t, and essentially multiplying it by u of t at one moment in time, and then sliding it, multiplying it, sliding it, multiplying it, sliding it, multiplying it, sliding it. Once you've done that across the entire window, you add everything up, and that's your convolution. So that should sound familiar. If my u of t is a bunch of spikes, right? So I've got these spikes happening at moments in time. Then when I'm multiplying by h of t, I'm going to get something that looks like that, and like that. And if I have some that are overlapping a bit, so suppose I had a spike here, and then when I add them up, I'm going to get something that kind of looks like this at the beginning and then is going to go up a little bit and then decay, right? So that's exactly what convolution is describing. And that's exactly what we're doing in the first principle when we're doing a linear filter. So now if we think of more general, so that's what we've sort of seen so far. But what we want to do is process signals that are not necessarily spike trains, because we want to be thinking about signal processing at the network level. And so this u of t now let's pretend that it's going to be any particular kind of input, right? It's the thing that is, the motion of the fly in the environment that we're trying to capture. So once we think of it in that regards, then we now want to think about what the h of t is going to be doing to that u of t at this level of sort of network description. And the nicest way to deal with these convolutions, as you see, it's a somewhat complicated operation where we have to do all this sliding and multiplying and adding. There turns out to be a very convenient transform called the Laplace transform, which lets us essentially get rid of those convolutions and turn them into multiplications, which is wonderful because that means we just get to do some algebra. So I am also not going to explain Laplace transforms in detail. Again, lots of great web resources for doing that. But let's just use it in the way that I described, where we know if we apply a Laplace transform, it basically turns convolutions into multiplications. So now if I apply a Laplace transform to both sides, I end up with this equation. And in order to indicate that it's a Laplace transform, I've introduced a new variable s. So that's going to be my frequency variable, because the Laplace transform takes us into the frequency space. And I'm also going to, as an extra reminder, basically write, when we're in the Laplace space, all of the variables as capital letters. So now we've got a description in an algebraically manipulatable form. We've got an h of t, or h of s now that we're in the Laplace domain. And we have a form of our exponential. So we're in time, we were writing this e to the negative t over tau. But we have to put that in the Laplace domain as well in order to plug it in here and be able to do the multiplication and various kinds of manipulations I was talking about. So again, we could go through lots of steps and show you what the Laplace transform of this happens to be. But instead, we will pretend, as everyone typically does, that we just look it up in the back of our textbook, and out pops the answer, which is h of s is equal to 1 over 1 plus s tau. So this is the Laplace transform of the exponential function e to the negative t over tau. All right, so once we have that, now we're in a position where we can actually be doing the algebra. What do I mean by that? So now we have an expression which we can write down as x of s is equal to u, which is our input into the system, times, and let's just write this out, 1 plus 1 over s tau. And now the algebra part, right? So I can basically multiply both sides by 1 over 1 plus s tau. So that gives me x of s times 1 plus s tau. And this is going to be equal to my u. And let me expand that out. So this means we've got xs plus s tau x of s is equal to my u. And now I'm going to move my x of s over to the right-hand side and divide by tau. So this will mean that I have s x of s equals, and then this is going to be u of s minus x of s. So that was me moving my x of s from the left-hand side to the right-hand side. And now I'm going to divide by tau. So I take this whole thing and divide by tau. All right, so this gives me an expression which at first might not look that impressive. But again, if we're familiar with Laplace transforms, something kind of nifty has happened, which is we've got this s x of s expression on the left-hand side. And the inverse Laplace transform of s x of s turns into something we know and love, which is x dot of t. So we've gotten ourselves back into the time domain with something that's very familiar to us. It's that x dot. It's that thing that we use to describe all of our dynamics of every dynamical system. And the nice thing about this is that we now have a way of capturing all the standard theory and using all the standard theory people like to talk about in dynamical systems theory using differential equations. But we've related it directly to neural systems because we've accounted for the neural dynamics. So I'll just quickly rehash that in a much nicer form. So here we go. That's exactly what I wrote out, but with much neater handwriting than I have, and also there for posterity. And this brings us to the sort of exciting conclusion that if we write that equation out entirely with the x dot, it looks like this, what I've got at the bottom here. The nice thing about that equation is it is basically taking our input, it's taking our state representation, it's relating the two through what we're using as our postsynaptic current model. And in the top, we've got a comparison where, oh, I've got u of t, it changes at some point in time, it goes up to 1 from 0. So that's an instantaneous, perfect, really fast change. So if we thought that's what we were doing in our system, then we would be surprised when our system actually is the blue line, right? That's what we've put into a bunch of spiking neurons, and then we filter them, and we're estimating the system, and they're not that close. But if instead we thought, oh, the dynamics of my system is actually governed by this equation down here, then what we'd expect is shown in the red line, and you can see that's a very close match to the blue line. So it means now that we've really done a much better job of describing what's actually happening in this system over time. So with that, I'll turn it over to Terry to take you through a simulation.
Excellent. So, so let's build that example just to, it's also one that we've seen before, but we're going to spend a little bit more time on it because I think having the math somewhat makes it clear what's going on here. So we've run Nengo again. And first thing we're going to do is save this as a new file. So I think we're now up to example 9. And the default sort of Nengo model is actually pretty close to what we want, but let's write it again anyway, just to keep things clear. We're making our model. We have our, the very first thing we're going to have is a group of neurons. And we're just worrying about a one-dimensional case in this one. We have some sort of input. That's what the thing that we're going to control. And we're going to connect that input to our neurons. Whoops, from stimulus to there. There we are. And because in this case, what we really want to be doing is talking about the dynamics of what happens with synapses and having connections between things. Let's just do it right there. So this connection here from the stimulus into the group of neurons. No, let's actually build a whole separate ensemble. I was just debating there, so we could also play around with the synapse that's happening in this connection from the stimulus to the group of neurons. That's not really a synaptic connection, right? Because that's this sort of external input being fed into a bunch of neurons. And if we're really trying to make this map into the biology, then what we're talking about is the synapse that is happening between groups of neurons. So I'm going to make another group of neurons, and we're going to make a connection from A to B. And of course, this is the connection where, yes, there are synapses involved, and the default is a 5 millisecond synapse. So what do we actually mean is happening there? I'm going to pull up some spike graphs. Let's pull up a value plot, another value plot. And we want a slider to let us control this. All right, so again, we have a group of neurons. This is what's actually happening down at the bottom here. This is the actual spikes coming from the neurons. The top is just our visualization of decoding the data from those neurons. So the actual thing that's happening is I've got 100 neurons here, I've got 100 neurons here. That means I've got 10,000 connections. So each of these 100 neurons is connected to these 100 neurons. There's 10,000 connections in there. Nengo has automatically figured out the connection weights that make this connection approximate the identity function. So that's why B looks like, oh, hey, look, B is exactly the same as A. But now since we're talking about dynamics, the thing that we're sort of interested in is not just, hey, does it look kind of the same? What I'm really interested in is, hey, let's say my input instantly changes from -1 to 1. Well, it takes some time for this to happen. Okay, so this is what we're talking about. We're getting into dynamics, is what's controlling this. If we actually, so this particular curve that we're showing here, that is the curve that Chris went and derived and got the nice math for. If we went and just analyzed this in terms of that differential equation, then that would have been fine. Or so this is following the path of that differential equation. One way we can sort of think about that is if I go ahead and change this synapse to make it, instead of 5 milliseconds, make it 50 milliseconds. All right. Now what should be happening is when I make a change, now we're getting a much more gradual curve. Okay. This particular curve is a relatively common one analyzed in dynamic systems theory. And so it's sometimes called a low-pass filter. It's called an exponential decay. It's the standard simplest filter that's covered in pretty much all the literature. And certainly as we change around these synapse values, we will get very, very different behavior. And it's all sort of along the lines of, yes, the value is gonna go to whatever the input is, but we're going to change how quickly it's getting there. However, we've got some interesting range problems here, and that is, well, biology only gives us access to a certain amount of range here. It's a pretty wide range. You can go from 2 milliseconds up to about 200 milliseconds. But that seems like an interesting restriction on what biology says that we can do. What we're going to talk about next is how we can then take this underlying dynamics and go implement other dynamics from the system itself. I will also comment that it's a little bit surprising and interesting that this synapse that we're specifying at the level of individual neurons, we see the same effect, like even though that synapse is actually affecting things down at this low level, at this level of spikes, and you can sort of see, oh, hey, look, it's taking a little while for these spikes to change. All right? Even though it's happening down at the level of spikes, the overall effect on the representation is exactly the same. We can also think of it as in exactly the same way. Okay? The effect, we can either analyze it, think of it as a low-pass filter on the represented value, but what's actually happening is it's just a low-pass filter on the spikes themselves. The reason that works out is that the decoding is linear. All right, Chris, back to you.
Great, thanks, Terry. So now we've seen a nice example of introducing dynamics much more explicitly, thinking a little bit about the relationship between high-level sort of network-level dynamics and lower-level postsynaptic current dynamics. But again, we've been mostly stuck with feed-forward examples. As you probably know, if you're familiar with neural networks at all, when people deal with time series, so basically information data that's changing over time, be it speech or audio or what have you, you always use a recurrent neural network. And that's essentially because you're taking the state and telling yourself in the future what your state was in the past. And that's a nice way of being able to deal with time series. So unsurprisingly, we want to be able to deal with recurrent connections if we want to deal with time series data, which of course is the kind of data that ultimately biological systems are fantastic at dealing with. So the nice thing is that we can in fact use what we've already derived for a feed-forward input to a recurrent input. You'll notice that the only difference here between what we saw in the previous slide and this slide is that now we have f of x of t instead of u of t. So we're treating our own state as input to ourselves. And unsurprisingly, that results in a diagram that looks something like this. So for the moment, we're just ignoring input at all. So we're pretending there's sort of no external input. We're just focusing on how my state will change over time if I take my current state and feed it back to myself. You'll notice again that we've got that convolution operator showing up. And so we can, again, apply the Laplace transform. And that puts us in a very similar place that we were before, where instead of u of s, we now have f of s. And all of the math is the same. So I'm actually not going to write it out by hand this time. We can just look through it quickly. So of course, this is the same filter that we had before. So we have the same expression for the filter in the Laplace domain. Then these next steps are pretty much the same, just a little bit of algebra, and we end up with an equation which also looks very much the same, where we've got our x of s again on this side, which makes us excited because we know this is equal to x dot. And so when we go back into the time domain, we also find a very similar expression where all that's essentially happened is our u of t has now turned into our f of x of t. So if you felt like you understood all of the steps dealing with sort of feed-forward connections, which I think in some ways are a little bit more natural to think about. It's just, I have a time-varying signal, it's going through a filter and out something comes. Interestingly, exactly the same thinking and math and everything applies to the case where I have a state and I'm sending it back to myself, which in some ways is kind of confusing and seems like it's easy to get tied up in knots. Sort of reminds me of time travel or something like that. But ultimately, the math works out in such a nice way that we can really do all of the same things that we did with the feed-forward case with the sort of feedback recurrent case. Now, where do we have ourselves? Okay, so we've considered dynamics looking at the recurrent case. We've considered dynamics looking at the input case. But ultimately, of course, we want to combine these two. And more important than that, right? So this is combining them too. Here's a very simple way to combine them. Let's just add them. So that should keep everything pretty simple. So note that there's no assumptions about linear functions or anything here except insofar as we're adding the inputs. You can actually get rid of that assumption as well, but for now we'll just keep it. But the other thing that is kind of strange is that typically we don't really want to sort of find out what happens when we put a bunch of stuff into our system. Instead, we want to say, I want these dynamics, right? If we're going to draw on control theory and we're going to draw on dynamical systems theory, we know a bunch of cool dynamical systems. We know about oscillators, we know about nonlinear oscillators, we know about chaotic attractors, all kinds of fun stuff. We want to say, build me a neural network with those dynamics. Right now, what we've done is we said, okay, if I connect things up, what happens? So these are two different sorts of uses. So let's start shifting ourselves a little bit more towards getting what we want. Okay, so to do that, let's just first start with see what happens, right? So if I say x dot is equal to some f of x plus some g of u, what is that going to give me, right? If I put it into a neural network with postsynaptic currents of the variety that we've been looking at. So this equation comes from substituting for our f of x in the previous slide, our f of x plus g of u. So we're just saying that f of x is equal to this entire equation. And if you substitute that into the previous slide's equation, then you end up with something like this. Now we can ask ourselves, what could we change what we want to such that x dot ends up as what we started with? So it's kind of a weird way of thinking, but basically we're looking for an inverse function. So let's try to do that, right? So we'll start out by saying, okay, suppose I have some other function f prime and g prime, which is the one that I'm going to pretend I really want. And I'm going to say, instead of, I make it equal to what I actually want, I'm going to say, let me make it equal to, the same two functions I had before. So these are the ones that I had up in my x dot. But I'm going to multiply 1 by tau, in an attempt to get rid of that. And I'm also going to add x in an attempt to get rid of that, right? So the idea being that we've now constructed another function such that if we substitute it into the equation on the previous slide, it's going to essentially eliminate these two extra terms that show up. If we do that, then we can go through the steps and basically see that, yes, indeed, the x's are going to cancel, so this will go to 0. My taus are also going to cancel, so this will go to 1. And we're left with x dot equal to f of x plus g of u. So what have we done? Well, we said, okay, if I really want x dot equals f of x plus g of u, then I'm going to feed into my neural network this equation here, right? I'm going to feed into it f of x plus g of u plus x all times tau. And then we'll have quote unquote tricked our neural network into giving us dynamics which are really the ones we want, which is f of x plus g of u. All right, so we essentially found an inverse function, which is going to give us the dynamics that we're actually after. Okay, so as an example, right, we want x dot equals f of x plus g of u. Now we're going to set our implemented dynamics, that is, what we're going to tell the neural network to actually compute, to the following. I'm going to set f prime, right? So these are the f prime plus g prime that we had on the previous slide. We're going to set f prime equal to tau times whatever the f is plus x. And we're going to set g prime to tau times g. Now, of course, we can do that same sort of substitution. We can say, all right, I'm going to put my f prime into here. I'm going to put my g prime into there. And as before, these are going to cancel and give me 0. And my tau is going to cancel out these two taus, right, to give me 1. And we get what we wanted with, which is, again, x dot equals f of x plus g of u. OK, so hopefully you follow that along. It's a little bit of a sort of mental exercise in figuring out exactly what we really do want and what we're just telling the system we want and so on. But hopefully the end result really is one where you can just focus on exactly this. So suppose we want this. Now this might look really familiar. You might say, hey, that looks exactly like the equation that you just derived when you were telling me what's going to happen when I put a neural or a signal into my neural network. And it kind of looks the same. OK, it looks exactly the same. Except the difference here is that in this instance, this is going to be my network time constant, right? So this is essentially not my synaptic time constant. In the previous slides when we were saying, oh, what does filtering by h of t do? And we're noticing that it has a filtering effect, and the filtering effect is determined by my postsynaptic current time constant. That's perfectly fine. But now we're saying we want the entire network to have a filtering time constant of, in this case, 50 milliseconds. How do I enforce that? And I'm not putting any constraints on my synaptic time constant. So my synaptic time constant might be 2 milliseconds or 10 or 50. That would make life easier, or 100, or right. But for now, we're pretending that we don't have control over choosing a specific synaptic time constant, which is motivated by the fact that, as Terry was mentioning, time constants of particular neurotransmitters falls within particular ranges, and you can't just force it to have whatever range you want. Okay, so instead what we're doing is we're saying, I want my x dot to be equal to this equation right here. So what does that tell me? Thinking back to the previous slide, it means that we're going to make our implemented dynamics the following. So first we're going to multiply by tau and add x. So that's what we're doing here, right? So the f of x, or sorry, the f prime is going to be equal to my f of x, which is this with the tau in it, times tau. So this is now my synaptic time constant, right? So that's the synaptic one, times x plus x. And I can just rearrange that and give me this expression here. Okay, so this is my f prime. This is the thing that I will be telling my neural network to compute for me. And then my g prime is going to be just tau times u. So again, we've got our network time constant, and that's going to multiply by u. And then I'm going to multiply through with my synaptic time constant. That's my tau. And so I just have tau over 0.05 times u. So if we set our implemented dynamics to that, meaning when Terry is doing the simulation, he's going to rely on these equations to be telling the network what to compute, then we should be getting network dynamics, which reflect this equation here, right? So no matter the value of tau, we should always be having, if we set our time constant in our network to 50 milliseconds, we should always be filtering our input signal with 50 milliseconds. As we change tau, of course, we're going to have to be changing our connection weights and the functions we are telling the neural network to compute. But if we change them in these ways, then at the network level, it'll be performing the computation we want. And it also means that we need both feed-forward and recurrent connections because the taus do not match. So with that, I will turn it over to Terry.
Let's actually build this. All right, we're going to go to a new example, example 10. Whenever I'm building one of these, yes, let's use the recurrent connections to implement interesting dynamics. The thing I have to remember about that math is relatively small. So let's see if we can actually work through an example of building this up. So first of all, we want to know, well, what is the dynamics that I want to implement? Okay, and that's one way I think about all this is that I'm using a particular low-level synaptic dynamics to implement some other dynamics. The dynamics that I want to implement is the equation dx dt is, let me write this nicely, 1 over, we have some tau desired, and that's being multiplied by the difference between x t and u of t. Okay, so that's just like the equation for a low-pass filter. It's the same one that we've been using all the time. Hopefully I've got it written right there. You can sort of see that this scaling factor here, this tau desired, that's sort of controlling how quickly things are changing. And it should, it'll stop changing when x of t is the same as u of t. Is one way to think about that. But or you just look in the back of the textbook and say, oh, hey, I want a low-pass filter. What's the equation for low-pass filter? That's what the textbook says. Fine. Yeah, so tau desired is the network time constant. So we have that, but we have some sort of other low-level dynamics, the actual tau of the synapse, that we want to use to implement that. So all we have to do is just follow the steps that Chris said. And so we're going to do that, and we're going to actually just sort of define these as variables. So let's just say the tau desired is 50 milliseconds, but the tau of the actual synapse is, let's say it's 5 milliseconds. Okay. All right, so what's the rule? The rule is when you make your connection, your feed-forward connection, the one that's going, the one that's bringing in my input, and the input in this equation is u. So the one that's bringing in that input, we have to take whatever the equation, whatever my equation that I am trying to implement says, take the part of that that's about u. All right, that's u of t times 1 over tau desired. Take that and multiply it by the tau of our synapse. Okay, and that's the function that you want on this feed-forward connection. So, forward. And so I want to return tau synapse divided by tau desired times. All right, and just because I've now, we have this variable name question is what to call this variable inside this feed-forward function. We can call it x, but then that's confusing because x is also what we're calling our state variable. So we can call it anything we want. I'm going to, for clarity, to call it u. Okay, so that's our feed-forward function. So that's the function we're going to ask this connection from that's coming in to do that. And then, of course, our synapse should be tau synapse. There we are. So that's implementing the input part. And now we want to implement the recurrent part. We're going to do the same sort of trick. We're going to refine a recurrent function. That one is going to be a function of x. And the rule for the recurrent function is, all right, take the part of this equation that's about x, all right, multiply it by tau synapse, same thing that we did to the feed-forward thing, but then we're also going to have to add x. So we say, all right, I'm going to return. So how do we want to write this? We can write this as tau desired. Oh, let's do all the individual parts and then collapse it together. Tau desired times x of t. Okay, so that's the original equation. And then the rule is multiply it by the tau of the synapse. And then add, whoops, and then add x. Okay. Now some of you might notice that you could simplify that equation a little bit just by collecting the x's together, and that'll turn into 1 minus tau synapse over tau desired times x. Okay, those are the same statements. And then we're going to make that connection. From B back to B, the function is recurrent, and the synapse is the tau of the synapse. Okay, so what have we done? Assuming we haven't messed anything up, we now have this recurrent connection here from the neurons in B back to themselves. The connection weights along these connections are computed exactly the same way as the feed-forward connections. There's nothing new in terms of the neuron model itself. It's all still spikes. It's all still big giant connection weight matrices. The only thing we've done is we've said, hey, when you're finding the connection weights on this recurrent connections, find me the connection weights for this wacky function here. And the reason we've chosen that wacky function is that we know from the math that Chris just showed that if you combine this with this, you're going to end up with this particular desired function. So this is a way of generating a recurrent neural network that will have some particular dynamics that we want, even though the intrinsic neuron dynamics is something else. All right, let's run this and make sure it works. I'm going to run this. Let's save it as well. May as well go up to full screen. So now what should be happening is that if I change my stimulus, we should get this nice gradual change. All right. If we want to check, oh, hey, is that what would have, so what we're seeing here, okay, so first of all, this seems to be a success. We're having this gradual change, even though the actual synapse time constant is still 5 milliseconds. We can go ahead and check, well, what would have happened? So if we want to actually see, well, is this working? Is this the same as what we would have gotten if we had have set our tau synapse itself to 50 milliseconds? If I change the tau synapse to 50 milliseconds in this example, I should see something very similar. And I do. And then we can actually even double check this math that, well, if tau desired and tau synapse are the same, well, tau desired and tau synapse, those are going to cancel. That becomes a 1. So that means this input is the same as our totally normal input. 1 minus tau synapse divided by tau desired, well, that's 0. So that means in this particular case where your tau desired and your tau synapse are the same, then that means the recurrent network is trying to approximate the 0 function. And so yes, that is all going to be a connection weight of all zeros. Okay, so that's a good sort of sanity check for our math. But it is definitely, so it is the case that this is what a totally normal, if you have neurons with an intrinsic time constant of 50 milliseconds, then you get this behavior. But if we change the intrinsic time constant to 5 milliseconds, we can still get the same behavior. Importantly, this also means that we can go ahead and scale up even farther. So for instance, we can start asking for filters with longer time constants than biology has available to it. So for instance, we might say, I want a half-second filter. If I go ahead and change that. Now you will note that as I went all the way up to a half-second filter, it did not do a great job. That isn't a nice exponential smooth curve. This is exactly, again, neurons are going to be approximating the function that we're asking for. If I want to improve that, there's a couple different ways I could do it. One is I could increase my number of neurons. Another useful one in this sort of case is I'm asking for a 500 millisecond filter. My neurons themselves have a 5 millisecond filter. That's really, really small. But if we if we say, okay, well, what happens if, in this case, if biology was using something at the higher end of what's biologically realistic? So for instance, if I say 200 milliseconds, well, 100 milliseconds is definitely reasonable. 200 is probably at the upper end of what is reasonable. But if I have neurons that are sitting there at 100 milliseconds, at the upper end of what biology can do, right, now I can still have much longer smoothing than biology has access to. Okay. So I can have neurons, I can have the network integrate data, smooth data over a much longer period of time than any individual neuron is capable of, or any individual synapse is capable of. Okay. So that's, so basically we can have a bunch of neurons with these fast time constants are perfectly good at implementing much longer timescales, which might be useful for smoothing data over time. And a common thing that low pass filters get used for in more sort of engineering control theory context is noise reduction. So for instance, if I have this as my input, then you will notice that B ends up being sort of a smooth version of that input. That's exactly the standard application of a low pass filter. Tons of other applications, but that one's a pretty common one. So that all works fine. We can go ahead and use, we can use slow neurons to, or sorry, we can use a fast neuron to implement a very slow system. But then an interesting puzzle comes up. So fine, I can do, okay, I've got all these neurons with really, really, well, let's go back to the original example, 50 milliseconds. All right. I have a bunch of neurons with really fast time constants implementing a slow filter. That's great, we can do that. What about the other way around? What if I have a whole bunch of neurons that intrinsically have a very long time constant? So 50 milliseconds in this case. But I would like the network as a whole to behave much, much faster than any individual neurons. Right? That seems weird. That shouldn't be possible. You know, how can you have a bunch of really slow things working together to do something fast? That's weird. But it doesn't look like, but there wasn't anything in the math that Chris was showing that assumed that these taus are bigger or smaller than other. So what's going to go wrong here? And you know, think about that for a moment, or we can just sort of press play and see what happens. Right? So I've got a bunch of really slow, I've got slow neurons trying to implement a fast system. And if I run that, I'm going to go ahead and do this change. Oh, it works fine. Trust the math, don't trust my intuitions. My intuition was there would be something wrong in this case, that I couldn't have a bunch of slow neurons implementing very fast dynamics. But that's not actually the case. What's happening here is we're basically in this recurrent connection, it's building the thing that compensates for the slow time constant of the neurons. So this was actually a little bit of a surprise to us when we first built this. I'd sort of assumed that something would go wrong. It's fine. And even with sort of, up at the higher end of like really slow synapses. So like to give an idea here, so that's the actual synapses there are 200 milliseconds. As an idea about what a 200 millisecond looks like a 200 millisecond filter looks like this. Okay, that's the speed with which the neurons are, the synapses are changing their properties. Every time a spike happens, the neurotransmitter that's released is released over like this period of time. That's a ridiculously long period of time, 200 milliseconds. But we can still find recurrent connection weights such that the network as a whole responds as if there is a very fast time constant there. Cool. So that's going to be a really useful tool for doing all sorts of different for implement. So this general method that I'm showing here is a useful tool for implementing any sort of differential equation. All you have to do is follow the steps that I said of take the part that's about the input, multiply that by the tau of the synapse, take the part that's about the state value, multiply that by the synapse, and then add x. As long as you do that, you can go implement any dynamics that you want. The math gets a little bit trickier if you have a little bit more complex of a synapse model. So everything we're doing here is just with the basic exponential decay synapse. Similar idea though, it's just a more complex substitution to have a more complex synapse. Okay, back to you, Chris.
Perfect, thanks, Terry. So we just saw some kind of neat examples of using Principle 3 of the NEF. So also just to be clear, that is Principle 3. What Terry summarized at the end there is basically providing a method for mapping whatever dynamical system you'd like into one which is sort of at the low level mappable into biology. So where you have a particular synaptic time constant and response functions and all that good stuff. So we can also ask the interesting question, and the reason it's interesting is because it's clearly biologically relevant, is what happens if we let that time constant, that network level time constant, go to infinity? Making the time constant go to infinity means we're asking for a memory, effectively. So this happens in several locations in the brain. As you might know, you have a pretty good working memory, but it also happens in places you might not expect it. For instance, when the way your eyes are controlled. So the movement of your eye is typically encoded in the brain in terms of bursts of spikes, which indicate the velocity with which your eye should move. And because the command is sent as a velocity, something needs to do the work of turning that velocity into a position and then sending position information to your muscles, and then your muscles can move your eye. Eyes are so old that this is in fact a part of the brain we share with invertebrates and very simple vertebrates like fish. So you might remember in one of the earlier lectures, I showed that movie of the goldfish's eye moving around. And the reason we have been paying attention to this system is precisely because it was implementing what you might call a neural integrator. It was taking velocity signals and converting them into eye position commands. And so knowing what the tuning curve of those neurons are goes a long way to trying to implement that sort of network using Principle 3. In the human brain, there are sort of two parts of the brain doing the same kind of computation. One is called the nuclei prepositus hypoglossy, and the other is the vestibular nucleus. These are taking care of both horizontal and vertical eye movements and converting velocity signals, which are coming from frontal eye fields and other parts of cortex, into eye position commands. So an integrator itself is maybe something that you're familiar with, and we can think of an integrator as essentially an infinite time constant filter, linear filter. What do I mean by infinite time constant? I mean that if you stop giving it input, it just stays at whatever level it was. So you saw the examples Terry was giving. When he turned the input back to 0, the filter would essentially decay and it would go back to 0 as well. But with an integrator instead, once the input stops, as we see here, it just remembers what its current state value was, right? And that's a way of saying that is because it never decays to 0, the time constant is infinite. It's called an integrator precisely because when we write down the integral sign, we are essentially asking for something that will perform the same kind of operation, this linear operation. And it happens to map really nicely onto these inputs being my velocity from my frontal eye fields, as I said, and this being the output of the NPH, or the vestibular nucleus, which is where we actually want our eyes to go given those velocity commands. So it's a difficult problem to solve because basically as soon as you're dealing with infinities, you want, in the perfect case, you want to never forget something, which is extremely hard to do because of noise. But nevertheless, even though it's difficult to solve, especially with analog components, it's very simple to formulate. Namely, we want, for our simple linear dynamical system down here, we want x to never change as a function of x. So basically, we want that to go to 0. And that's what we're doing here when we set a to equal to 0. And then, of course, we do want to remember all of our inputs. And so we'll just remember them perfectly. So we'll make b equal to 1. Or in the sort of more general vector case, b equal to I. So what that says is that at every moment in time, my update to my state is going to be equal to whatever my input is. So if we have a constant input of 1, then we're basically multiplying that and adding it at every moment in time until we turn it off to 0. And then we're not adding anything. So my input is 0 and my recurrent connection is 0, right? Because I set it to 0 here. And so nothing happens. So we'll have x dot equal to 0. X dot equals 0 means no dynamics, do not change. And that gives us this sort of integration behavior, or what you might want to think of as a memory. All right, so in the case of where we have one-dimensional input, then we're going to say that my identity function is equal to 1. So just as a reminder, we're basically saying a prime equals tau times a plus I. This was the mapping. So this is my function on the previous slide. I was writing this as f of x. And this is me making sure that I get, x into my desired dynamics. But because a is equal to 0, this goes to 0. And so we just have an I, and I in one dimension is a 1. So that explains why a prime equals 1. And then b prime is going to be equal to tau times b, where b is my thing that's multiplying my input function, right? So this is the thing we were calling f of u. And again, because we set b equal to I, which is 1 in the one-dimensional case, then b prime is just equal to tau. And that explains why we get b prime equal to tau here. So the system we're implementing, we've got our state variable representation in all the neurons. We have a recurrent connection, which is going through our a prime matrix, which is equal to 1. And we have our input going through our b prime matrix, which is equal to tau. And so if we kind of do just the same thing that Terry did on the previous example, but we now use a prime and b prime as we've defined here, this should give us a neural integrator, right? Or a kind of memory. And so here's an example of that neural integrator running over time, where we have those perfect step functions, and we can sort of compare those to exactly what's going on. And you can see that, in fact, we can do quite a good job of implementing a memory with what looks like an infinite time constant. In fact, if I let this run for a really long period of time, you would see that state representation actually drift over time. But because things are changing so quickly here, as they actually often do in the eye control system, that drift becomes negligible. So over to you, Terry.
Okay, so let's go implement that integrator. I'm going to save this as a new file. And I'm going to go through the same process as before of let's write down the equation that I want and then go ahead and implement it in different ways. Okay, so the equation that I want in this case is a nice simple equation. I want dx dt to be equal to u, right? It's an integrator. That's what I like. That's the definition of, that's how you write an integration. All right, so that's the equation. All right, we don't have this tau desired thing anymore. We still have the tau synapse. Our forward function is always, all right, take the part of this equation that's about u and multiply it by tau synapse. So, all right, that's going to be this one. And then our recurrent one is going to be take the part of this that's about x which is nothing at all. So that's 0. We take 0, we multiply it by tau synapse. We also get 0. But then we add x. And so that means our recurrent connection is going to be return x. So in theory, that is all we have to do there. All right, we have, this should now be implementing an integrator. Okay, so let me just run that first to make sure this works. Okay, so if we feed in 0 to an integrator, our neurons are sitting there at 0, that's fine. I'm going to feed in some number, it's going to go up. I'm going to feed in 0 again, and it stays still. Feed in something else, a negative number, it's going to go down. Feed in 0, it should stop there. So that is computing the integral of its input. That's 0.951. Go fast. There. Oh, of course, it's not going to go on forever, right? If I feed in a 1, that line is not going to go up forever. It's going to stop at some point. Why is it going to stop? As we talked about in one of the previous lectures, whenever neurons are representing information, they're representing information within some radius, within some range of values. And so the same thing is going to happen here. So there is going to be some sort of saturation, and that's fine. So it's not going to represent values outside of that range. But inside that range, it should be doing a pretty good job of computing integral. Before we go back to Chris, there's a couple things I want to use this opportunity to sort of play with and show off. So one big one, especially whenever we're implementing these integrators, is what sort of things affect their accuracy. Okay. One big thing is, of course, the number of neurons. As I increase the number of neurons, it will become more accurate. I can go up to 1,000 neurons, say. All right. Okay, and we should be finding that this is now much sharper. The timing should all be the same. Like increasing the number of neurons is not going to change how quickly it's going up or down, but it is going to change the noise properties. One other big thing, though, to keep an eye on is what tau is being used in that recurrent connection. And in particular, if I go to a very, very fast tau, you will end up seeing a lot more drift. Oh, actually, this is an even more extreme example. Sometimes, with a very, very fast tau, it does a really, really bad job of approximating this function. Okay, a lot of that is due to this. Well, to this particular calculation here, it's got to calculate a very small number. If that small number is being calculated with a lot of noise, then hey, we have a situation here where no information is getting through. Right? We could, of course, perhaps fix that with more neurons. Usually that's safe. Yeah. So with more neurons, that will. Oh no, that one is still being pretty weak. You probably have huge numbers of neurons. We would have be able to do that. The more reliable way when doing these recurrent connections, have your tau of your synapse be reasonably large. Interestingly, in biology, it does look like recurrent connections tend to have fairly long time constants. So I will, just as a general rule of thumb, if you're doing a recurrent connection, put a reasonably large time constant on it, 100 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds. This is definitely something when you go ahead and map to a biological system, you will want to go and check what the biological system is doing. Vast majority of the time, you will find something with a reasonably long time constant. And then, of course, you can do fun experiments like, oh, hey, look, with more neurons or less neurons, how noisy does it get? How much does it drift? You will generally find, especially in the one-dimensional case, that there might be, maybe we can actually, if we have very small numbers of neurons, you have fewer neurons and a slightly lower time constant. What I'm looking for is we should have a situation where, there we go, we got one right there. So it started at 0, and then it drifted down, even though my input was 0, it drifted down, and then it's sort of stabilized to this particular value. You will often find with these integrators, when you have small numbers of neurons, you will have sort of preferred points that they're at. There's some neat analysis you can do to actually show why that's the case. Chris does that in the book. There's basically, it turns out that you end up, the noise of the neural approximation, you end up with a bunch of point attractors instead of a line attractor, but that's a whole other separate discussion. But as rules of thumb, use a reasonable number of neurons, see how well it's behaving, and in particular, make sure that you've got a reasonably long time constant, 100 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds in that range, and that should work well. So so that sort of overall covers the theory stuff. There's one syntax thing, so Nengo syntax, that I want to highlight about this style of function because it comes up so often. We've got this situation where I've defined these two functions, and this sort of syntax, it'd be, this sort of thing happens so often, it'd be nice to have some simpler syntax for that. And in particular, what's interesting about both these functions is these are both linear functions. They're both taking your input, multiplying by something, and that's it. There is a syntactic shortcut in Nengo to do that. We've seen it before, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to indicate it anyway. I could also say that the transform is tau synapse, and the synapse is tau synapse. So this line here is sort of this transform. We can think of it as a shortcut for defining that particular linear function. In terms of the neural model, those two things are exactly identical, but this sort of thing comes up so often that this is useful syntax to know about. And similarly down here, B to B, the transform in this case is 1, which is the default, so we don't even have to specify that. And so that is a much sort of more compact way of specifying exactly the same model. Back to you, Chris.
I thought it would be interesting, instead of just talking about representation, to think about computation and dynamics in terms of an example. And so we introduced this example of working memory, where we want a neural circuit that's going to store an input state, i.e. doesn't change over time. So that should sound kind of familiar. We also want it to be clearable. So, we don't just constantly add new things in and try to, exactly cancel out what's in there. Instead, we can just say, okay, forget everything that's in there right now. We already saw this last one, how we can clear the storage, the memory that is, by basically multiplying two numbers together, where one of those numbers is a control signal and the other number is the state. So that control signal, which we were calling alpha, if we set it equal to some negative value, then that would clear the state. Essentially, the state would decay until it got to 0. And if we set that to 0, then we now know we were basically implementing an integrator. So we would then just take the input and add that into the state over time until we were able to store that memory. Because essentially, once the input went away, we were then computing x dot equals 0, which is, as Terry was just pointing out, exactly what an integrator is. And I'll just throw this in here because I always like to think of it this way. It's basically, if we say x dot is equal to u of t, and somebody says, oh, what is x going to be equal to? Then what we would naturally do is integrate both sides. And integrating both sides means that x of t is equal to the integral of u of t, which is precisely the circuit that we've been building. So we initially specified this high-level program or dynamical system, which is x dot equals this equation here, where our x is our memory, right? So x dot is basically how that memory is changing over time. Our input, as always, is b, and as I was just explaining, alpha was our control signal. We can now put both of these ideas together. We know what an integrator is. We know how to multiply two values together. And now I think we run into which is an interesting question. It's worth spending a little bit of time on. The question is, what exactly is the architecture of our circuit going to look like? Is there only one, is really the question that we're asking ourselves. So I think there's a very intuitive architecture here, which is we kind of just do what I said, right? So we take u, we take alpha. We know that what we want to do is basically multiply alpha by x and add that into u multiplied by b, right? That's just essentially implementing the equation. So we could do that. We can take alpha multiply it by X. That's what this connection here is doing, right? So now we've got, if you'll recall, basically when we do multiplication, we have a 2D population here. We have both of those inputs. They were X and Y before, and now they're just alpha and X. We have them represented separately. So we're going to have an alpha representation and X representation. And then out of that representation, we'll project their product into wherever we want that product to go, right? So in this case, we want that product to go back into the thing that was representing the state, because the overall state was going to include both alpha times X plus the input B, right? So that means that essentially we've implemented the equation that we had on the previous slide in this population of neurons. So this is a very intuitive way to go from the equation into a particular architecture. But as I mentioned, we should probably ask the question, is this the only architecture, or even is this the best architecture for computing that particular function? So let's consider a different architecture. In this one, we're going to see if we can do essentially all of these things at once in some interesting way. Now, the way to construct this architecture is to notice that there are essentially two variables. Those two variables are represented twice, once in population number 2 down here, so this 2D population, and once in this 1D population. Because one of these is 2D and the other is 1D, and they overlap in their representational spaces, that suggests maybe we can actually get rid of one of these populations. Namely, we can get rid of the one that is only one-dimensional. So we could just use a two-dimensional population and represent everything there, because one of those representations literally is X itself. And this suggests this secondary architecture that I have at the bottom here, where now we're thinking of the same kind of 2D population, where we're going to have X as one dimension and alpha as the other dimension. And then, and we can call that X, like the whole state. So if we're now thinking of the big X as including both basically my little x and my alpha, we can then compute the product coming out of that, i.e. alpha times X, as just being the product of those two dimensions in that two-dimensional population. So now we have these two competing architectures, but you can sort of tell by looking that one is essentially simpler than the other. And by simpler, I mean that there are fewer synaptic connections. The reason we might think that it could be important is because every time we have a synaptic connection, we are also implementing a filter, right? We have a synapse. That synapse is filtering the signal in some way. So in the top instance, we're filtering things twice when we're trying to compute that product. And in the bottom one, we're not, right? We're just doing it once because we're connecting right back into itself. Okay, so now we can look at what the circuit actually looks like if we build it with that second architecture. Over to you, Terry.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So let's go build that one. And let's start completely fresh. Math model. All right, so we've got our group of neurons that is going to be our state information, our memory, and also let's start giving things more meaningful names than A and B. So this is an ensemble. It has some number of neurons in it. I'm going to say 200. And in this setup, we're going to have this as be two dimensions. So there's two things being stored by this group of neurons. One of them is the value being stored. And then the other one is, what should I be multiplying this number by? And if I multiply it by 0 and feed it back to itself, that would be an integrator. If I multiply it by a negative number and feed it back to itself, that would be a decaying low-pass filter. And if I multiply it by a positive number and feed it back to itself, well, then yes, it's going to explode off to infinity, and that's probably not all that useful. But that's what we're going to be storing in our memory. I'm going to explicitly have two different groups of neurons that are going to store the input and our desired control value. So I'm going to call this, we'll call it input. Ensemble equals 100. 1. And that's a group of neurons. I'm going to need some sort of controller so that I can manually adjust the input to that. So I'm going to say stimulant input is my node. memory connection to input. All right, so that's going to be the value being fed into our integrator, our U value. And then we're also going to have this other thing, which is our control, which is what Chris was calling alpha. Stem control. Connection from the stem control to control. All right, so these are two one-dimensional values. And the control is telling us what we're supposed to do with this memory. The input, that's what's going to be going into the memory. So now let's connect things up. So first of all, this input and this control need to be fed into memory. If I just said connection from, let's worry about the control first, from control to memory. If I just say that, Nengo's going to yell at me. And that's because there's a little error message, we have a little error messages coming down here. That's because control is one-dimensional, memory is two-dimensional. The default when you make a connection is an identity function. An identity function can't take you from one dimension to two dimensions. So we need to be explicit about this. If I want the control to say affect the first of the two dimensions in memory, one way I could do that is I could have said that this is the function that should be computed, x, 0, and function equals func. Okay, so that is defining a function such that this value from control will be fed into the first of the two dimensions inside memory. This is kind of ugly, so as we've mentioned before, Python or Nengo has some nice syntax to do something very much like that, or exactly the same as that, but just in a simpler syntax. And so what that syntax is, we'll just do that, is Nengo connection from control to memory 0. Okay. So this memory square bracket 0 thing, that's using Python slice notation saying, hey, look, memory has multiple things, has multiple dimensions being represented in it. I want to talk about the first dimension. Python is a programming language that starts counting at 0. But these two ways of doing things are identical as far as the neural model is concerned. So that's going to feed in our control signal into one of the dimensions in here. We're going to do a similar thing with the input to memory. That's going to go in the other dimension. But we had this rule when doing dynamical things that you want to scale you want to scale the input by the tau of the synapse. We haven't yet defined the tau of what synapse we're using. I'm going to say we're going to use 100 milliseconds, using that rule of thumb of generally when doing recurrent things, use a long time constant. And so we're going to do a transform of tau synapse. Okay. So that's building, again, the sort of the first part of our integrator. Now we're going to build the recurrent connection to turn this into a controlled integrator. That's going to be a connection from the memory back to itself with some synapse. Use tau synapse and some function. And what is this function going to be? Well, let's go ahead and define it. So this recurrent function, it takes in x. In this case, x is two values. It's a vector of two values. So what we want the system to do is just to return the product of those things. So I could just write this as return x0 times x1, and then say function equals recurrent. So that would work. Oh, assuming I spelled synapse correctly. Yeah. There's a couple problems right there. So first thing I'm going to do is, I'm worried, just for my own sanity, this whole writing the function this way, I find this very confusing in that I can never remember what x0 is and what x1 is. So I will very often, as the first sort of line on the function, if it's one of these functions that has multiple dimensions, is I'll go ahead and give meaningful variable names to things. So then let's just call these what they are in the equation. We have alpha and, oh, x is a bad idea, and memory. Okay, and now I can write this as return alpha times memory. Okay, so that's sort of in the hope that in the future, although now I'm using memory for two different things. Let's do, might be clearer. Maybe I'm going to try one more attempt at this just to show all of these things, all of these different things that I'm writing are all equivalent. And it's about trying to make sure your function is somewhat readable so that you can look back on this in the future and figure out what was going on. But there's still this other error that Nengo's giving me, which is that, oh, hey, hold on a second. I'm connecting from memory to memory. Memory is two-dimensional. This recurrent function only returns one value because it's only supposed to affect one thing. It's only supposed to affect this dimension of memory. Okay. So we're going to do that. I'm going to make the function right. But there is still one big thing that I have not yet done, and that is our rule when making, when implementing dynamical systems, is when you do the input, make sure you multiply the input by tau synapse. When you're doing the recurrent connection, take whatever, like this is the differential equation that I wanted to implement, take whatever that is, multiply it by tau synapse, and add the actual state being remembered. Okay. All right, so there's a bunch of different steps to happen in there. But now we have something that should, in theory, unless I've messed something up, implement, and let's get that on the screen so we can see everything, implement the controlled integrator. Okay. So let's pull up a value plot here, and pull up a slider, and pull up a slider. So in theory, what is supposed to happen here is that if my control is 0, this thing should act as an integrator. If my control is negative, then the content of the memory should decay down to 0. And depending on how negative it is, that's how quickly it'll decay back to 0. And if positive, then it should go off to infinity. Let's see what's happening here. All right. So first of all, this memory has 2 values in it in this plot. Okay, fine. Let's label those 2 plots so that we can see what the heck's going on here. So I'm going to right click on this and I'm going to say show legend. So that's just at least going to label those 2 lines. Let's give them meaningful variable labels. So let's set the legend labels, and we're going to call these alpha and x. There we go. That's going to help us keep track of what's going on here. So our x value is at something. Let's see if it's acting as an integrator. If I give it a positive number, it goes up. Put it at 0, it stays there. Negative number, it goes down. Put it at 0, stays there. Go down to a negative number, goes down, put it at 0, stays there. That's looking pretty good. You will notice that little bit of a jerk that was happening there. That's because I made a mistake. Does anyone see a mistake in my code? Chris, do you see the mistake in my code?
You're missing a tau.
Exactly. When I made this connection here, I did not specify the synapse. There we are. You can actually sit down and do the math and figure out exactly why that has that particular effect. Basically, you having two different filters at different parts in the system. So now what we should see is if we can set that to 0. Now you will also note that it's not as good. I see you're seeing a lot of drift there in that integrator. It sort of went up even though the value was 0 there. Let me just go back in time and see if I can capture that. So I changed the input to 0 around here, and then you can see that drift up over time. The main reason for that is the networks, the neurons are trying to approximate this function, and this function that we're getting to approximate is now a nonlinear function. And so this is just going to be a harder function for the neurons to approximate. We can, of course, make up for that by increasing the number of neurons. So we go up to, say, 500 neurons. It's also the case that those 500 neurons, they're both trying to approximate that function. They also need to represent now two things. There's a larger space that they need to approximate this function over. Okay. But 0, yay, down, yay. Okay. You make all sorts of interesting, nice quantifiable theories about, okay, given neurons with different properties, how many neurons you need to implement this with a particular degree of accuracy. That's great. So this is acting as an integrator, fine. And then the real challenge is, okay, do we have this controlled aspect working? So if I pull this control down, will this memory decay back to 0? And let's find out. And the memory, so first the blue line is the control signal. The green line, the thing that we're remembering, has decayed back to pretty close to 0. Make it go even faster to 0. Here we are. So this is now trying to forget things. If I now play around with my input, it'll still do stuff, but then it'll decay back to 0 pretty quickly. So this is now acting more like a low-pass filter. And if I go ahead and put that to 0, my control signal to 0, now it should be acting as an integrator again. Okay. And just for completeness' sake, yes, it is the case that if we go ahead and make this a positive number, that should cause the green line to go explode off to infinity. Of course, it won't quite get to infinity because the neurons are only good at representing values between -1 and 1. And then put it back to 0, and we should be acting as an integrator again. So now I have a system that I can store data in, I can change that data, so I can integrate data over time, and I can clear the memory whenever I feel like it. And all of these things are happening just under the control of the inputs of these other groups of neurons. And again, there's nothing special happening at the neuron level here. It's all just spiking neurons and recurrent connections and just leaky integrate and fire neurons. And we end up with a nice controlled integrator.
Yay, success. So yeah, Terry, you made a really good point at the end there that there's nothing special going on in the neurons. I think just to elaborate on that a bit more, you're calculating a nonlinear function because of course you're multiplying alpha by x, but there's nothing nonlinear in the dendrites. So there's nothing sort of along the lines of what people have hypothesized you might need in order to actually perform those calculations. Now, there's all kinds of interesting and subtle things to make of that discussion, but I'll just leave it at that and say, yeah, we've essentially assumed the simplest kind of neural model with linear dendrites and are still able to do this huge variety of nonlinear dynamical computation, which is pretty cool. So moving right along to even more cool dynamical computations, I can introduce the simple oscillator. The oscillator is kind of like the two-dimensional integrator in the sense that an integrator is really a pretty fundamental calculation, dynamical calculation you want to do. When you move to 2D, you can actually do things like oscillations, which you can't do in 1D unless you're doing nonlinear calculation. So just to give you some quick background on a simple oscillator, these are often called simple harmonic oscillators. They map onto different kinds of physical systems. So things like pendulums, for instance, or the example I have is a spring that's connected to a block that's sliding on a frictionless surface. Here, the x is position, F is the force which is being exerted on the box or the mass, and then the green line, which you can barely see, that's the velocity. So at the very end where this box is drawn right at this moment, the velocity is sort of close to 0, but starting to head in the opposite direction. So we can write that equation down describing that spring system where we have K, which is our spring constant, and X. And so the force is just proportional to negative K times X. And of course, F is also always equal to MA. So we have MA. We can write that out as X double dot. And so we can then solve this by saying negative Kx equals mx double dot. Divide both sides by m. Negative K over mx equals x double dot. Or as people often like to write, x double dot plus K over mx equals 0. So that's a second order linear differential equation that is describing this oscillator. So this is not in a form that we're familiar with because of course we've been looking at all of these examples where we have essentially x dot equals ax plus bu. In this instance, things are kind of easy on the input side. We're assuming a non-forced oscillator, so this just goes to 0. But what we would really like to do is write this in this form, which it clearly isn't because you have a second order derivative in your x, and we don't have a matrix A. But we can do a couple of substitutions and so on, which I won't show, where we turn that equation into one that does look like x dot equals ax. Here, omega is essentially a frequency, so we can think of it that way. It's sort of easier to intuitively understand what's going on in this equation. And now we can see basically how it maps onto the components in this diagram at the top here. So think of x as being related to position, so that's related to the black line. So the first derivative of that is going to be x dot, which is the velocity, which is shown in the green line. And so now if we look at this equation, we can see that x2, it's kind of like your velocity, right? So this is acting like a velocity, and this one is acting like a position. And if you take the derivative of the velocity, right, then, which of course is what we're doing here, then we've got our acceleration x double dot. So you can sort of see, I haven't gone through the details, but how this equation maps onto that physical system. And so if we implement this equation, which is now in a nice form and know exactly how to implement that, then we'll be able to show an example of neurons doing oscillation. And why would we care? Well, oscillation is something that actually shows up a lot in biological systems. For instance, walking or any kind of repetitive behavior, chewing, swimming, you name it. Those all seem like things which have oscillators heavily involved. And indeed, when people describe the movement of, for instance, fish or lampreys, they will think of these as chains of coupled oscillators. And when you record from neurons, they look a lot like they're encoding the position and velocity of the animal, right, and the muscles. So although we've kind of abstracted away here to just a linear dynamical system, it doesn't take very much imagination to figure out exactly how that relates to all kinds of interesting biological systems. And if you're interested in details, you can grab our book and look for some examples in there. All right, over to you, Terry.
All right, oscillator. Let's go back, start a new example. Wipe all this out. Model. Okay, so I want an oscillator. I look up in the back of my textbook what the differential equation is for an oscillator. And it's something, and the sort of the standard linear oscillator is dx dt is some matrix, and we're going to multiply that by x. Okay, and so again, now we're just going to use our standard techniques that we now have memorized about how to take any differential equation and implement it with neurons. All right, so I've got my group of neurons. It's going to be my oscillator. It's got to be a two-dimensional population. It's representing two things, the two dimensions in x. And I need to implement my function that is going to go and do that oscillation. Okay, so what is that function going to be? Well, the function is going to be take this, multiply it by the tau of my synapse. All right, tau synapse is 0.1. I'm picking a long time constant because that's generally suggested. We're going to multiply it by that, and then we're going to add x. So if I take this equation here as a matrix, or if I take that, if I do that math, then the actual matrix that I'm going to need is 0, negative. Let's define that. Omega, so this is the frequency of my oscillation, somewhere around 10. We'll go ahead and adjust that in the future. So here is, that's my basic matrix. I want to multiply it by tau synapse. And then I need to add x. And if I'm thinking about this as a matrix, then what that's going to be doing is that's adding the identity matrix to this. So I'm going to do a 1 and a 1. I'll show another way of doing this math in a second, but I just wanted to do this as an example of implementing the connection just using the, because it's a linear function, I can just use the transform notation. Transform is matrix, and the synapse is tau synapse. Okay, so that's one way we can implement it. Just using that nice simple notation. I do want to do it in a little bit more careful a way, or a little bit more explicit a way, because it's going to help us lead into the next example. What I'm going to write now is just another implementation of exactly the same thing, but we're just being a little bit more explicit about what function is being computed here. What we want to have happen in this recurrent connection, x has two values in it, x0 and x1. And really what we want to return out of this is two values. So what this matrix notation is meaning is we're going to take one of these columns, multiply it by x, that'll give me my first value, take the other column, multiply it by x, that'll get the second value, or possibly rows. I can never remember which way around matrices are supposed to go. But what that's going to mean is the basic equation says what I should be returning out of here is x1 comma x0. Or sorry, negative x1 comma x0. Negative omega times x1 comma omega times x0. That's what the raw differential equation is saying. Possibly with those negative signs flipped. No,
that's good. That's
I
good.
think I got it right. All right, yay.
It is rows, not columns, but
yeah, okay.
And I guess if you want to be technical about it, maybe the x, like in the top, dx dt, you could write that as x1, x0 and x1.
Yeah.
On top of one another. Anyways, yeah.
Yep. So that's what the differential equation is saying. And then principle 3 says, all right, take whatever I'm going to return, multiply it by tau synapse, and add the identity, or sorry, add x. So if I'm adding x, well, x has two elements in it, x0 and x1. So I'm going to add x0 to the first one. I'm going to add x1 to the second one. Oh. Okay. So that's the same thing. And you can go ahead and confirm that this matrix operation is the same thing. But we're being a little bit more explicit and also showing that, look, there's nothing special about being linear. It's just Nengo happens to have nice syntax if it turns out to be linear. Otherwise, if it's a more complicated function, well, then you've got to specify the function. Okay, so again, those two things are equivalent. implement it whichever way you feel is clearer. I'm going to go with the second approach because we're going to need that for the next example that we're going to give. Okay, so does this work? All right, I'm going to pull up a spike plot, pull up a value plot, and I'm going to pull up an XY value plot that'll be showing the state space. All right, now what is it that we wanted to do? This is going to be an oscillator, so that means if we're at a particular value in the state space, it should start going around in a circle. And let's go ahead and hit play. And what do we get? Right, so it's both doing what we want and not doing what we want. Yes, it is oscillating around in a circle. It's just a circle that is right here starting, it's the infinitely small circle at the origin, which is not quite what we wanted. So we're going to need something to move this state out, and then so we can start the oscillation. Okay, we need to kick this oscillator somehow. Because it's doing exactly the math that we asked it to. It's just since it starts at 0, 0, oscillating around 0, 0 means staying at 0. That's not helpful. So we're going to give us a little bit of a stimulus. And what's that function going to be? Function of time. I'm just going to say, all right, just return 1, 0. If t is less than, I don't know, 0.1, else return 0. All right, so that'll be something that just sort of gives it an input at the beginning of the simulation. So when t is less than 0.1, and then the rest of the time it doesn't do anything. Stim to the oscillator. Okay. Now, if I run that, what's going to happen? All right, so here's my neural activity. So the neural activity is up here, and you can look at the neural activity and you can see, okay, look, yeah, individual neurons are definitely oscillating. That's good. And then these plots here are showing the actual state space representation. So taking the neural activity, decoding out what's being represented. If you plot it in sort of over time, then yay, it's two sine waves. There are a sine wave and a sine and a cosine going back and forth. And if we plot it in the state space diagram, you can see, all right, we've got this nice oscillator. Okay. We can of course control the speed of this frequency of this oscillation. Okay, because that's this omega value here. The units on this are radians, so 2 times 3.14. That should be a 1 Hertz oscillation. And that is pretty darn close to 1 Hertz. The default window, the width across here is half a second. So we are seeing a half second there. That's looking pretty good. So that, and again, we've changed the frequency of the oscillation, not by changing anything about the neuron properties. The only thing we've changed is the recurrent connection weights in this population. We can, of course, say, all right, let's go twice as fast, 4 times. All right, so this should be a 2 Hertz oscillation, and since we're showing 500 milliseconds, we should see 1 cycle through there. Okay. There is, of course, going to be some sort of upper limit. I don't know, what happens with 1,000? All right, we're doing something. This is exactly the situation where I'd want to sit down and actually measure what the heck is happening and find out what frequency we're actually getting. My guess is we're not exactly hitting 1,000 radians. We're hitting something else. And then that would be interesting questions of, all right, do you want to change numbers of neurons? And it becomes how well are the neurons approximating this function? But we're certainly getting very fast responses here. Cool, and that sort of oscillator seems like it would be a useful building block for building up all sorts, as Chris was saying, all these behaviors and anything where you need some sort of rhythmic behavior.
I thought you were just using leaky, integrate, and fire neurons, Terry, but it looks like you have a burst neuron in there.
This is a fascinating aspect of this. So when we go ahead and look at these, what the neurons are doing in this case, if you go ahead and, if you don't think it's coming from a simulation, if you just look at it as like data you might record from a biological system, yeah, this sort of bursting behavior of, hey, we get these, the neurons are quiet for a while, and then you get this bursts, and everybody's bursting at a different time. This starts looking pretty biological. And it's really interesting to me that the behavior we're getting here is not about anything intrinsic to a neuron. It's the fact that we're using whatever the intrinsic neuron dynamics are to produce this overall high-level dynamics. And then we end up getting this bursting behavior just out of the network interaction. So that becomes a really important part when taking a look at biological data and mapping it onto biological data is, if you know, for instance, that your neurons are bursting, because, hey, that's what the biological data says, you might not necessarily know whether or not those neurons are bursting because of anything intrinsic to the neurons or just because of how the neurons are wired up.
Or a combination of both, probably.
Or a combination of
happens
both.
A lot of the time, yeah. Yep.
All right, so we have this group of neurons that can do an oscillation. That's wonderful. It's not all that exciting because, hey, one of the first things people found out about neural networks is if you connect them up recurrently, you can get oscillating behavior. I mean, we've got this cool way of getting exactly the oscillation frequency that we want. That's wonderful. But something that's traditionally been really hard to build in neural networks is a controlled oscillator. Right? I want to have some other group of neurons be able to control the rate at which this group of neurons is oscillating. That's going to be important if I say I'm swimming or walking and I want to be able to walk quickly or slowly. If this oscillatory behavior is controlling something, we probably want to be able to control this rate. And right now, when I change this parameter, right, I'm getting a new set of connection weights. Right, that is, okay, this is the set of connection weights that gives me this other rate. But that's not really an option that biology has access to. Biology can't just say, all right, I want to walk faster, rewire all my neurons to have new connection weights. Whenever I say something about biology doesn't do this, I am quite sure there is some creature somewhere in the world that does do that, just because biology does a lot of weird things. But that's not a particularly common thing to have a sudden rewiring of your neurons when you're just changing how quickly you want something to happen. But since we have the NEF, we can use exactly the technique that I just described here to say, all right, we know how to compute nonlinear functions with neurons. Let's go ahead and do this. Okay. So I'm going to need, so I'm going to save this example. I'm going to go on to a new file, 15. All right, so what am I going to do here? We can get rid of this. We can get rid of this. We can get rid of that. So I need a new group of neurons that is going to control what my rate of oscillation is. So I don't know, we'll call this speed. Dimensions is 1, so that's just a one-dimensional. Speed is node 0, and we're making a connection from the stem speed to the speed so that I can control this group of neurons. So I have this group of neurons. I really want this group of neurons to act as a scaling factor in this part of this equation, right? Because I want it to scale this omega thing. Okay. How am I going to do that? Well, we're going to do the same trick that we did with the controlled oscillator, or with the controlled integrator. And we're going to do it as one population again. And what we did with the controlled integrator is we went from a one-dimensional population up to a two-dimensional population so that we could store that extra value that is the control signal. So we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to say, all right, this thing here, this 200 neurons, Yeah, we're going to go up to 3 dimensions. We're going to say that this oscillator, this recurrent connection of this oscillator is only affecting the first 2 dimensions. Python syntax for the first 2 dimensions is that. The stimulus input is only affecting the first 2 dimensions as well. Good. So this is now a 3-dimensional population. And then we're going to send this speed in, and that's going to be the third of those 3 dimensions. Speed to oscillator. Okay. Yes, again, Python starts counting at 0, so os2 is the third of the 3 dimensions. So that's going to feed in the speed signal into there. And now the only thing we have to do is modify this recurrent connection to take into account that third parameter. We'll have this speed thing be a scaling factor on omega. And so we can just put that right in here. We're going to say, all right, we're also going to multiply x2 in this. That's going to affect that one. Oh, and this line is getting too long. I'm going to put it onto 2 lines. And we're going to put an x2 in there. All right, so you will note this is now a nonlinear function. We have an x2 times x1, so we now can't write it in the matrix way or with the transform syntax. But it's still a perfectly normal function, and we can still get neurons to go ahead and approximate it. Okay. We're probably going to need a few more neurons because, again, it's a nonlinear function. We're probably going to need a few more neurons to approximate that. So we'll go up to 500 neurons, see if that's enough. And in theory, what should be happening, I'm going to pull up a slider over here so that I can control the speed. All right, let's go ahead and run that. All right, so what do we got? We are currently representing the value here, and the oscillation's gone. Why is the oscillation gone? Oh, right, we're multiplying by 0 at the moment. So multiplying by 0 says oscillate with a frequency of 0. We're not oscillating. Let's go increase this. Ooh, we get a nice little oscillation. And we can slow it down. We can stop it. We can go backwards. All right. If I go faster and faster, here we are. Now we get this interesting effect here that as I go really fast, my oscillation is getting smaller. Why is that happening? That's sort of unexpected. Whenever the advice that we gave in the previous lecture that, hey, when weird things are starting to happen, at least more than 50% of the time, the reason is think about the radius. This group of neurons here by default it's a 3-dimensional value, but it's a radius of 1, so it means it's optimized over points within the unit sphere. If I've got one of those dimensions set to 1 or -1, that means the other dimensions are going to have to be really, really, really quite small in order, right near 0 in order for that to be inside the unit sphere. So I need to increase, if I want to be able to use this full range of my speed, I need to be able to increase the dimensionality, or sorry, increase the radius of that population. Radius is 1.5. Now I should be able to go with full speed and not have that reduction. Let me go forward, we can go backward, we go ahead and slow things down. Okay, this is a controlled oscillator. This is an extremely difficult neural network to build using techniques other than the NEF. To me, this sort of thing is sort of the payoff of going through all of this weird math, is that, okay, fine, I can actually implement, I can find a recurrent network that goes and gives exactly the behavior that I want. and I can control that, and I don't have to introduce sort of weird aspects to my neurons, because all these neurons are still just leak integrate and fire neurons. It is definitely an open question about whether or not biology does start bringing in other sorts of details, other sorts of biological details in order to implement something like this. What we're at least establishing here is it is not required. And then that way you can go ahead and investigate. Cool, if you add in more biological details, does that mean you can get away with fewer neurons? Does it mean that you can implement it more accurately and things like that? And that's just cool investigation. But I think it's really important to note that you don't need any other aspects of neurons in order to implement something like this. Back to you, Chris, or?
No, in fact, I think we'll just leave it with you, Terry, and get you to show people some other kind of cool dynamics that are easy to do. So you've given this really nice example, yeah, where you've got a nonlinear dynamical system, but of course there are much stranger nonlinear dynamical systems.
Yep. And usually at this point when people are saying, okay, yay, differential equations. So we have a way of implementing arbitrary differential equations. That's kind of cool. That's sort of a new thing that sort of a new tool that normally I'm used to when building neural networks. Fine, I can use networks as function approximators. With this, I can now use neural networks to implement any differential equation I can think of. Of course, it's only going to approximate those differential equations. There's going to be details there. But one differential equation that often comes up as sort of a next thing of, oh, okay, well, yeah, you can implement this. You can implement a controlled oscillator. But can you implement chaotic attractors? So that's sort of, since people ask this all the time, we actually have this as a built-in example in Nengo. So this is going to be the first time I'm going to show built-in examples. When you have Nengo, if you go up to this open file window and you go to built-in examples, there's this tutorial section. So this is sort of stepping you through a lot of the different things that we built, but one of the examples in there is the Lorentz attractor. Okay. And this Lorentz attractor, so this is the standard chaotic attractor. This is the butterfly network. This is, you know, the Lorentz butterfly attractor. It's a three-dimensional one, and there's the differential equations for it. We've slightly transformed it in order to have it oscillate around the point 0, 0, or 0, 0, 0, because, you know, by default, the neurons in Nengo are built to approximate values, you know, in a sphere, or in a radius around 0. So we've just shifted it a little bit, but there's the differential equation. That's the standard that's the differential equation. This is implementing the principle 2, which says, hey, take whatever the differential equation says, multiply it by the synapse value, and add x. So it's exactly the same sort of form that you've been seeing so far. And I go ahead and run this. And we should be getting, let's go ahead and make that a little bigger. All right. And we've gone ahead and implemented that differential equation. This is also a nice situation where I can go ahead and expand this out a little bit. There we go. So now we can actually see, yes, the neurons are approximating the standard chaotic attractor. Doing a perfectly good job of that. So now that we've got the Lorentz attractor, there's lots of other sorts of things you might want to do. One interesting one that we've played with in the past is if you want to use an oscillator to create some sort of arbitrary pattern of motion, we can definitely do that, and you can definitely write that if you've got some complicated differential equation that is the path that you want, we can go ahead and write the differential equation for that, get neurons to approximate it, and see how well they do. And there's a bit of an interesting example here in what we're calling this heart oscillator. I just want to sort of show the code there. And I will, let's make sure it fits on the screen. Here we are, so it's all fitting there. So first, what I want to do here is I first want to show the behavior, and then we'll go through the code and see how this is happening. So the final main behavior that I want to show, pull up this oscillator, I'm going to set my range to a little bit bigger. and I'm going to hit play. And here, whoops, let's make it a little bit bigger than that. Range 4. There. So what we've got here is an oscillator that is tracing out a very different path than those sorts of things that we've seen before. And if you go ahead, you can find out the differential equation for a heart. This is, the internet has everything, so you can go ahead and find that differential equation. It turns out if you just try to get Nengo or you try to get the neurons to approximate exactly that equation, it doesn't work particularly well. And a big part of that is that right at this point right here, the function becomes very hard to very hard for neurons to approximate. So a very small difference in, so as we slow this down, so we got to remember what it is that this differential equation that we're approximating is saying is, hey, given the point that you're at in the space, which direction should you be moving? Okay. And as we get close to the point at the top of this heart, okay, so when we're here, the direction we should be moving is down to the right. But then when we're just a little bit over, the direction we're moving is up to the right. Okay. So there's a very big nonlinearity at this point in the state space. And so the neurons are going to have problems approximating that. You can always do it with more neurons. That's going to be fine. But that always opens this question of, can we as an engineer sort of design better ways of doing this, or different ways of doing this?
Quick comments. So one is to help people with that internet search, if they do want to find the differential equations, is to look for a cardioid as opposed to a heart. And then the other one is, I would just like to emphasize that another reason these kinds of discontinuities are so challenging is because of the noise. And you can really see it in this simulation, right? You can see how thick the heart is. It's not thick because we're using a thick pen to draw it. It's thick because the neural state is actually bouncing all over the place, right? So if you bounce a little bit and then you compute a nonlinearity, you'll be in the wrong place for the nonlinearity and it will screw everything up, and you'll sort of gather this error over time as you keep going, and it starts looking terrible.
Right. So how did we get this to work? What we did is we said, all right, well, even though this is the behavior we want, I want neurons that are oscillating and representing some heart. And to give a more realistic example, I mean, the heart is kind of a pretty example, but a more realistic example would be sort of like the trajectory of a leg, or your walking motion, something like that. What we can do is, I've got two groups of neurons here, and what I'm plotting here is actually the behavior of this group. If I go ahead and look at what this group is doing, it's exactly the standard oscillator that we started with. Okay? And indeed, you can sort of see that that is the same function we'd implemented before. What we're doing here is we're saying, well, look, let's set up a basic oscillator, and then when we read data out of that oscillator, nothing says we have to read out the identity function from that oscillator. Right? The whole point of neural representation is that whenever you're reading stuff out, you can do a different weighted sum and you can get some other function of that. And so if we use a nice simple state space for the oscillator part, but then in the readout, we can do a different function. And the particular function we're doing actually is this thing here. And what this is saying is, all right, do the inverse tangent of x1 over x2. So figure out what theta is. Where are we on the circle? All right, so that's just math for what is the angle right now. Okay, and then given the angle, again, you can go ask the internet what the equation is for a cardioid. So given an angle, and there's this long, this is just straight off the internet. All right, this is some wacky calculation that if you do that, you will go ahead and find out, well, what is your R value? Given an angle, how far out should you go? But then what we actually want to feed into this group of neurons is not the angle and the radius. We want to actually feed into this group of neurons the X and the Y value. And so we're going to now go convert from polar coordinates back into x and y. So the cosine of the angle times the radius, and the sine of the angle times the radius. This is a bizarre, long, complicated function. I think this is a great example of something that is incredibly complex to write down in normal math terms, might turn out to be a nice, smooth function that neurons are perfectly happy to approximate. And indeed, this is a fairly nice function that neurons are going to do a good job of approximating. And so that is what's being computed on this connection that goes from the heart oscillator to the thing that we're actually computing as a heart. So that becomes an interesting way of making sort of an arbitrary path out of a dynamical system. We've used it for doing things like, all right, here's a path that is me signing my name. All right, and just fine, wire up, here is now a group of neurons that will generate that path. And so this sort of general trick seems to work pretty well. Okay, so yeah, there's a lot of fun things you can do with differential equations. I think we've really only scratched the surface. We'll start seeing more and more examples. I've generally found that the hardest thing for me is getting my head around and trying to build things with using neurons, is that instead of thinking about it as sort of a normal programming language, I'm used to writing all sorts of programs in normal programming languages. What this is really saying is that neurons are really good at implementing feed-forward functions, and they're really good at implementing differential equations. And so really the challenge is then taking what you want this biological system to do, or your theory about what you think this biological system is doing, translating it into the language of differential equations. And then Nengo can automatically take that differential equation and build a neural network that will actually approximate that. And that's the general process of everything that we go through.
Thanks, Terry. Yeah, so you just did a nice example of introducing a couple of simple dynamical systems and then some more complicated dynamical systems. In fact, chaotic attractors are as complicated as you get. And the reason you stuck with 3 dimensions is because that's the first place in continuous space that you get chaotic dynamical systems. But you can imagine there were no assumptions made about the number of dimensions or the kind of nonlinearity or anything. And so we can actually go quite a long way, all the way up to building huge models like Spawn, in fact, using these same exact principles. So we saw a oscillator and a controlled oscillator, a chaotic attractor, the Lorentz. We looked at heart shapes, and we can leave it as a take-home test to go and make a square oscillator if you want to. I'm just going to summarize where we are right now before we do a slightly longer example. And essentially what we saw today was principle number 3. Can we build a nonlinear dynamical system? And we gave a whole bunch of examples. We gave a controlled example. We gave some simpler linear examples as well. But we implemented them all in spiking networks, not doing anything special to the neurons, just basically figuring out a way to calculate connection weights, as we promised, as a different way than using backpropagation, but one which is similarly effective for a whole class of interesting functions. And those principles, as I just mentioned, are quite general. So vector spaces are, pretty general kinds of representations. You can kind of express anything you want in a vector space. And so we went up to 3 dimensions, but you can just keep pushing that and going up to much higher dimensions, as we will talk about actually in future lectures. We looked at nonlinear computation, obviously, both in a feed-forward way. So just what we saw at the end there was doing a nonlinear feed-forward computation on a dynamical system. But also nonlinearities in the network themselves are clearly possible and actually quite useful for things like control. And we were implicitly the entire time dealing with, as we always have, heterogeneity. So choosing random tuning curves for all the neurons, dealing with nonlinearities over space and over time, and also thinking about ways of handling noise. The only place that really showed up explicitly was at the end when we came up with that method for doing sort of weird paths through a state space. But every time Terry said something like, oh, we should add more neurons, that is also, of course, a way of dealing with noise. And as I mentioned before, every time we're doing an optimization for weights, we're also modeling the noise to some extent by the way that we're solving that optimization problem. So that brings us to the end of the NEF. This has actually been, even though it's been several hours of lectures, quite quick compared to reading a whole book. And the next thing we need to do goes beyond the NEF and really looks at scaling. So how do we get from here, where we've got all of these interesting components, to something like Spawn, where it's doing representation of concepts and inferring different kinds of patterns over sort of syntactic structures and controlling flow of information through itself, and on and on and on. So the subsequent lectures will really be focusing on that, on scaling, which I think is absolutely the most critical thing if you want to get to cognitive models. But before we get there, I think it is nice to dive into an example where we take all of these components and think of them in a more cognitive modeling kind of context. So Terry is going to take us through an example where he builds a critter using only things that we've seen to this point without introducing the extra complexities in the SPA, and seeing, what kind of reasonably interesting things can you do even with only a couple of simple components. So join us for the next lecture where Terry is going to take us through all of those steps. And thanks again for joining us for this one, and we hope you're enjoying this. Oh, I forgot to mention my t-shirt. So this is from 2014.
You've got the original one, I think. Yeah.
I think that might be from year number 1. Yep.
Yeah. This one's also getting pretty old. You can see it starting to fade away. I think this is 2017, though. I don't know. I must be rough on shirts.
This would have been the 6th year, I guess, that we were doing the summer school. So unfortunately, we're having to do it in this format, but nevertheless, covering the same
material. We get a wider audience. I think this is fine.
Maybe. All right. So see you next time.
All right. See you next time.